Okay, I suggest we begin. Maxine, can you stop sharing? So welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm the academic director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES, and I'm delighted to welcome Brigid Laffan to deliver this virtual visions of Europe on EU collective power from Brexit to COVID-19. Brigid is emeritus professor at the European University Institute in Florence. There, she was until this summer director and professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies. Previously, she was professor of European politics and vice president of University College Dublin. She's a member of the Royal Irish Academy and of the board of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice. We're very proud to have her as a member of ACES's advisory board. She is one of the, I would say, most prominent scholars of European integration and contemporary Europe. In November 18, Politico ranked her as one of the women who shape Europe. She's been awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award from the British Universities Association for Contemporary European Studies, UASIS, and the Theseus Award for outstanding research on European integration, and even the Ordre National du Mérite by the President of the French Republic. She's published very widely on different aspects of European integration. She has a special expertise in budgetary politics, but it's much broader than that. She is working on a book on the EU's response to Brexit, and she'll share some of the findings of that book, the arguments of that book, but also extend it to a wider canvas. What we will do is she will talk for about 30 minutes. Then she and I will exchange a little bit about the presentation, and then we'll open up to Q&A with you, the audience. As in most webinars, what you should do is to post your questions in the Q&A, and I will read them out to Brigid, and she will answer them. There's also a kind of parallel audience watching live streamed on YouTube, and if they have questions, they will put the questions to our technical host, who will send them to me in the chat. So YouTube viewers, your questions can be answered as well. And then eventually we'll post a recording of this event on our YouTube channel, so you can watch it again, or you can tell your friends, colleagues, and students to do so. Okay, Brigid, why don't you start sharing your screen, and over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for being with us this afternoon. It's always been a pleasure for me to engage with the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, and it's one of the good things I think about scholarship on the EU now is that we have quite a number of interdisciplinary centres across Europe, and they maintain quite a lot of interaction and contact. And I've been associated with ACES from, I think, probably from the beginning, from the creation. And thank you also for your introduction. So let me share my screen. And from the beginning, now I need to, yeah. So to begin, I had also hoped to be with you in Amsterdam this afternoon. And in fact, I had a ticket. I actually had a ticket to fly to Amsterdam today, but given COVID, that's not possible. why I want to talk about collective power Europe today is I'm at the very early stages of thinking about this, and it's always good to run embryonic ideas by people just to see, is there what resonance it has? Is there something there? So this is very preliminary. And therefore, I really look forward to your feedback and your input. And of course, when one looks at the last 10 years or 10 years plus now of the EU in practice, then this is a set of institutions, a polity that has been both tested and contested, stress tested with all of these crises. And we have the perma-crisis, as some people call it, or Jonathan, the polycrisis. But crisis has been the leitmotif of the EU now for a very long time, and it's generated a very large and rich literature. But I think we need to begin to think not just of how the EU handled each crisis and what it reveals about the EU, but also the more macro question of what kind of polity we have ended up with through these crises. In other words, what levels and dynamics of continuity and change do we see in the EU over this period as it faces another decade of change and transformation? I'm also struck by the extent to which, when the EU confronts a crisis, almost inevitably, political actors, but also scholars and media commentators, always the word existential will creep into the discourse at some stage, both instrumentalized by political actors, in my view, but also academics are very quick. We're very quick to rush to judgment of what's happening. And of course, there now is, as there should be, a very significant literature on, and a lot of research going on the potential disintegration of the EU, because of course, political systems may rise, consolidate, and also fall. And so one should never think of European integration as this linear process from non-integration to integration. So I want to situate how I'm approaching this very much in terms of how should we think about the EU, not post-crisis, because as we know, crises are always around the corner, particularly in a time of fundamental transformation and change, but what's happening in the EU as a macro polity. And I also begin from the premise that the EU has been resilient and has demonstrated and represents, in my view, a robust political order. And it has garnered sufficient legitimacy to deepen its policy capacity in the face of these crises. And I give you a quote from Jones et al., that piece I'll talk about later, who their piece on failing forward argues EU's authority continues to strengthen. So I've been thinking about how should we think about authority and capacity in the EU, and not that this is a vision of Europe, but rather it might yield insights into the nature of the EU in the 21st century, that focus on authority and capacity. And I was also minded to do this because of the recent Kellerman and McNamara paper that opted to use the historical lens of state building processes to shed light on what they define as the EU's unbalanced and dysfunctional development. And they argue that the macro sociological, macro political forces of war and market making, when those logics go in tandem, then you get what they call the most complete political development, marked by political consolidation and robust institutional development. But that the EU has been uneven and unstable. And again, I think I certainly uneven, but is it that unstable? This architecture and that it's been pushed forward by the processes of market integration without the pressure of war. And then they argue that when war and market making are in tandem, the sort of Charles Tilley view of state building, particularly war and extractive capacity, then you get a centralization of power. And that the development of the EU presents us with a case in which market making has been dominant and security logics attenuated. And this has led, in their view, to incomplete crisis-prone institutions. Now, they even go so far as to say that the crises in the EU have that the political crises in the EU are due to these crisis-prone institutions rather than the exogenous forces of the crises that the EU confronted. And they look in detail at both the Eurozone, where they argue, as we all know, about the absence of macroeconomic buffers and incomplete banking union, and then Schengen at migration, asylum policy, and external borders. But they also conclude by saying that the EU's robust legal and regulatory powers stand in stark contrast to its minimal independent fiscal capacity, its diminutive administrative apparatus, and its non-existent coercive capacity. And again, I'm very attentive to the language here: minimal, diminutive, non-existent. In other words, this is a weak polity, an unbalanced polity, and the word dysfunctional is also used. The language is very strong. And of course, if we think of the nation state as the model of political order, then of course the EU is weak, because it certainly can't pass the stateless test. Its extractive capacity, as we know, is limited. Its coercive capacity is limited. No one can kill for the EU, and its administrative capacity is also attenuated. But of course, the EU is not, and in my view, can never be, a scaled up version of the nation state. And while I think it's really interesting to think about and Kellerman and McNamara are not arguing that the EU will end up as a state, and certainly not a nation state. But I think we need to be careful when thinking about the EU that we don't use models that perhaps are not that appropriate, because then when one looks at the EU, one sees weakness and dysfunction, and one may miss strength and capacity. And it's more that area of strength and capacity that I think we've under-researched. And when one looks at and Dan Kellerman, because he was part of this, Eric Jones, Dan Kellerman, and Sophie Meunier, their failing forward thesis, again, their argument is that the EU moves forward, it deepens and is propelled into deeper integration, but it fails forward. Failing forward, and there's a juxtaposition here, because failing by definition is weakness and lack of success. It's not failure, it's failing. But forward means advancement and momentum and onwards. So I've always thought that one needs to be careful too not to overstretch the failing forward. And they are, in their recent CHEP special issue, careful not to do that. They specified the conditions. Now, they say that the EU, basically, it's common in the EU. They don't say this is all of the time, but that it's common in the EU to have lowest common denominator outcomes, intergovernmental bargains, and incomplete institutions. And again, I think one needs to think about what lowest common denominator means. In intergovernmental, what does that mean in the EU of today? And what do we mean by incomplete institutions? Now, they argue that this failing forward properties in the EU will happen with a high threshold for action when there's a really intense crisis. It depends on the existing competence of EU institutions and the cost of unraveling, the cost of undermining European arrangements. But of course, when we look at COVID, as we will, health was not and is not even a shared competence with the EU. It's complementary. It's not shared. So again, the costs of undermining European arrangements were limited because there was none, unless you argued the neo-functionalist argument that it brought the market into play and whatever. But it was these two pieces got me thinking, do we need to pay more attention in research on European integration now, post all these crises, into capacity and into what the EU actually does? And that got me to think about collective power Europe, and to think of it in terms of what is the functional equivalent of what would traditionally and historically be called state capacity. In other words, where does the EU get its heft from? And I think when one looks for power and capacity in the EU system, one firstly needs always to begin from the premise that the EU is a compound polity consisting of the whole and the parts. Because of course, the EU may have a weak extractive capacity, weak coercive capacity, and weak administrative capacity, but it rests on states with a hell of a lot of capacity. And in fact, it leverages that capacity in its own actions. So again, to always think in terms of the compound, the whole, and the parts. And I conceive of collective power as the ability to get things done, to project power in two senses. Firstly, the EU in action, the ability to develop instruments to achieve its goals, to keep the agenda moving on. In other words, to do politics and public policy making, the means that the EU brings together. And then, of course, the ends to which those means are applied. So in the I see capacity in both means and ends. And in thinking about power, I'm thinking more, rather than the Robert Dahl view of power as exercising A power over B, but rather the power to amass resources, to develop policies and policy instruments, a policy toolkit, and affect outcomes. And also, and I've said this already, but I think it bears repeating, not just to see power as Brussels, but also the power to harness the collective. And then I want to do this by thinking about two more recent crises. So if the failing forward, the arguments were developed particularly in relation to the Eurozone crisis, but also later quite a literature on the migration crisis. But we have two more recent crises, Brexit and COVID, that I think merit analysis from the perspective of collective power. So the EU was confronted with a polity crisis. It was confronted with a member state that had decided it was exiting, it was going to leave. And first member state to leave, and not just a small member state, but a very large and significant state. So this was, in my view, a potential crisis, a very serious potential crisis for the EU. So how did the EU respond to this? And as Jonathan said, I'm writing a book on this, and I've some really rich material that I'm working through now on the response to Brexit, because I think it reveals certain things about the EU that are worth analysing. So the means, firstly, was framing. The EU very quickly framed what Brexit meant to it. It did so on the 24th of June, and by the time the heads of government met on the 29th of June 2016, the broad outline of the Brexit response was on paper. The framing that the EU had of Brexit was on paper and was articulated. And what the EU did in 1 week was an endogenous shock to the polity. The departure of a member state became an exogenous shock. In other words, the UK from then on was defined and treated like a third country in the making. Its status within the EU had dramatically altered. Secondly, the EU engaged in very cohesive strategic communication all through the Brexit process. I happened to be sitting in the Task Force 50 on the day when the House of Commons was going to vote that night. And I was told what the line to take was that night. In other words, all the capitals, the Council and the Commission had an agreed line in response to what was going to happen in the House of Commons that evening. And of course, the EU deployed transparency as an instrument. Everything was said to everyone all of the time. But then the EU relied also on law and process, on Article 50, on the NNWN, no negotiations without notification. In other words, the UK could not probe with different capitals or different institutions what it might want. And then the EU decided on phasing. There would be a divorce, followed by negotiations on the future relationship. And of course, time became a very powerful instrument because, as Michel Barnier frequently reminded us, the clock was ticking. And then within the institutions, all institutions created dedicated institutional nodes. And dedicated institutional nodes were designed to insulate, to create a cordon sanitaire within the EU, so that within each institution, Brexit would not take over other areas. And it was described by in one of the interviews we did as Brexit was not going to be allowed pollute the rest of EU policymaking. These nodes were run by Brussels level actors. In other words, the Council Task Force was chaired by Didier Sowes, who was a council official, a senior council official, not the presidency of a member state. In other words, key Brussels-based actors wanted to ensure that the EU response was collective from the beginning. In other words, the principles would be set at European level, and then national interests and preferences had to be molded into what was the overall chapeau of the way the EU was going to handle this. Also, the EU deployed its expertise and knowledge, and I would say that this was one of the instances in which there was a co-creation, co-evolution of the EU's response across the institutions and the member states all of the time. It was, in other words, there were interinstitutional battles were off. There was no room for interinstitutional battles, but rather the houses, the EU, worked together, and then they worked very effectively back into the member states via the representations into Brexit task forces in national foreign ministries and the Sherpas of the heads of government. So it was a continuous process of engagement at the multi-level system. It was happening in Brussels, but with the links between Brussels and the member states were continuous via all sorts of different channels. Now, what did the EU achieve? Well, it created and maintained unity across years of negotiations, which again surprised the EU and many of those involved. And it wasn't just that unity was maintained, but unity became a practice norm in these negotiations. And there was an agreement on two major treaties with the United Kingdom, the withdrawal agreement and the future trade agreement, despite the fact that the EU was dealing with a UK that had two general elections, two prime ministers. And remember, Prime Minister May lost 42 ministers alone in her government on Brexit. In other words, and the UK Parliament was prorogued. So there was a very unstable interlocutor on the one hand, but the EU managed to get to a yes and avoided no deal. It defensively protected all of its red lines, and it reinforced public support for EU membership, which became a problem for Europe's populace. But of course, it hasn't ended up with a solid or stable relationship with the United Kingdom. Now, why collective power was displayed in the Brexit process? Was it that this was an easy dossier? I would say it was, firstly, that the heads of government and the leaders of the institutions, so in other words, the member states and the collective, understood that the EU needed, that this was polity, that the EU needed to be preserved and protected. They developed a compelling narrative about the union is our future. We regret that the EU, that the UK is leaving. This is lose-lose, but we will pursue our interests. And again, when one looks at the documents, the EU wasn't obfuscating on the question of interests and preferences. It was saying, we will protect our collective interests in this endeavor. In the process, there was a rediscovery of market power Europe and the customs union. And of course, there was also an opportunity to show extraordinary solidarity with one member state, in this case with Ireland. So no veto players available. And the UK was regarded not as a member of the club, but as a former member of the club. And the club had to be protected against it. So then moving on to COVID. Now, COVID was very different, of course, high levels of contingency involved, and the omens were very poor. EU's power in health is complementary, life and death remains national. So the EU did not have the instruments available to it to step in. It didn't affect all member states at the same time, and all member states, as they began in the early weeks of March, understood that they faced problems for PPE, ICU beds, etc., etc. And there was huge complacency. The European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control was telling everyone in January 2020 that that Europe could handle the crisis. And of course, we also had a single market. There was, in the early weeks, some restrictions on the single market for goods. So the omens were really poor that the EU could have, the EU would respond to this. Now, I'm going to talk about the RRF, but I think one should also not underestimate the common procurement of vaccines, which avoided the worst excesses of vaccine nationalism, which would have been a disaster for the EU. So again, the EU means we begin to get the common framing. Christine Lagarde, extraordinary times require extraordinary action, no limits to our support for the euro. And then the union, from the heads of government, the union and its member states will do whatever it takes to address the challenges. So this, whatever it takes, with a resonance to what Draghi said on the euro. And they looked immediately to the existing toolkit. The ECB was very quick in terms of liquidity provision this time. The Commission developed the support for employment with SURE. The ESM, which in the end wasn't used, came out, and you had let out clauses for the Growth and Stability Pact, and also competition policy, competition law. So the instinct was, in the first instance, in the first weeks, to look round at what the available toolkit was and to begin to plug the gaps. But then there was a desire for a transformative instrument, and that challenged the status quo. And here, and we can discuss what the RRF means, but I wouldn't argue it's a Hamiltonian moment, but it was a major development in European integration. So the largest ever EU budget, 1.8 trillion, also the way in which the Commission used this, not just to fight COVID, but also to link it to the strategic imperative of climate change, the addition of the conditionality regulation, and the fact that the EU would borrow on the financial markets and on the capital markets, and that the EU budget would repay this money. So the ends were significant, but how did the EU get to this, and as quickly as it did? And here I think one needs to think about this multi-level system, not in a vertical sense, but also the vertical and the horizontal, and the almost continuous engagement of key actors on this subject from about the third week of March onwards to the European Council in July. And when it comes to agenda setting, I think that the letter from 9 heads of government in March was extremely important. Why? Because it wasn't the usual suspects. So it wasn't the Mediterranean, the creditor states. It included France, Belgium, Slovenia, I think, or Slovakia, I can't remember which, and my slide is hidden, and Ireland. So in other words, it wasn't just the usual suspects, and they asked for a common debt instrument. At this stage, both Germany and the Netherlands were staunch opponents of this. Can I excuse myself for a minute? I need to switch on the light or I end up not being able to look at my notes. So 2 seconds. Apologies. I was slowly descending into the gloom in Dublin. So Germany and the Netherlands were obviously staunchly opposed. Now, I think that the institutional configuration here, one needs again to focus on the intensity of engagement. So 6 European councils, 5 of them were online, and then the last one was the marathon. And the European Council remained via the Council, but also the Sherpas were constantly involved in this process, bilaterally, multiple bilateralism, and with the Commission and with the Council presidency. And the first thing the heads of government did was they tasked the Eurogroup. Now, the Eurogroup matters because that was going to bring in domestic finance and economics ministries, without whom nothing could have been done. Unless, as we know, the one way you can stop things happening in public policy is get your finance ministry to say no. And they began to think about, and in their documentation referred to, a recovery fund, European solidarity, and that this would be temporary, and that they needed guidance from the heads of government in order to move it to the next phase. By the 23rd of April, the president of the European Council issued conclusions. Again, interesting, not collective conclusions of the European Council itself, rather the president, because there were many member states did not want to sign up at this stage to a package. But they allowed the president of the European Council to establish the broad parameters: a recovery fund, sufficient magnitude, and directed towards those parts of Europe that most need it. And here we have tasking again, and the tasking is to the Commission this time. And the Commission was asked to specifically link it to the MFF. And then the game changer too, in my view, was when you got a shift in preferences in Berlin. And Macron had been working on Merkel all of the time. And of course, the German economics and finance ministries were involved in the Eurogroup. And they pitched for a joint recovery fund, grants, and common debt. So you began then to get momentum behind this, but very quickly you also got the response from the frugals, led by the Netherlands, Austria, Denmark, and Sweden, where they did not want loans and they did not want common borrowing. Grants. They wanted everything to be on the basis of loans with high levels of conditionality. So the first major cleavage, Germany had shifted preferences, but the small net contributors had stayed opposed. And then the Commission proposals come out, and the Commission proposals Next Generation EU, this recovery fund was part of it, the 750 billion plus and the 1.85 trillion. Now, what's I think important to think about was, firstly, there was no resort to differentiated integration. This was done at the EU 27. And I would argue that that was the first and perhaps only dividend that Brexit has bought, because I see no circumstances in which, if the UK was a member state, that it would have agreed. It was not extra treaty, it was within the treaties, and it was building on the Commission capacity to administer funds, and the Commission, through both cohesion policy and other policies, was well versed in this. And then it went into, I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to speed up, went into Chefsache. The member states started then the battle to get to yes. And Charles Michel held multiple meetings with heads of government, phone calls, meetings, to see what could be put into those concrete proposals to get to a yes. But I also want to draw attention to the extent of bilateralism that took place. Italian Prime Minister Conte met 10 of his counterparts. Mark Rutte met 9. Merkel and Sanchez 7 each, and Orban 6. So these were all the representatives of different coalitions within the European Council at this stage. But again, it points to the fact that there was such a high level of engagement from the heads of government on this. And I don't have stats on other dossiers, but this was an extraordinary engagement by heads of government in the development of this instrument. And then we end up with the July marathon. I had, as it was going on, I was wondering, would it be the longest in the history of the EU? But it was the second longest. But also the detail of the outcome, 68 pages, and of course, cross those 3 cleavages, those supportive, the frugals with Finland on the margins of that group, and the authoritarians on the rule of law. But it still was, if there was a European Council in February 2020 that failed on the MFF, if anyone had said by July that the EU would agree to the EU borrowing collectively in order to give grants and loans to the member states, then I certainly wouldn't have thought that possible, but it did ensue, although it is still a temporary instrument. So I would say, to sum up, on the collective power Brexit, I would say it was orchestrated by a combination of the European Council and Brussels-based actors. It was Chefsache. The members, the heads of government always kept an eye on Brexit, but it was remote control. They delegated. Once they had collectively framed, they delegated. It took, for the guidelines on the Brexit negotiations, 3 to 5 minutes in the European Council to agree them. So all of the heavy lifting had been done prior to the meetings of the European Council. There was very effective collective framing. The EU deployed its knowledge base, its organizational and institutional capacity, and worked from the basis of principles to inform substance and process. And then the EU, as I said already, remained united. So then the RRF and COVID, again, the European Council was the central source of political authority, but here it played a very hands-on role in the actual negotiations and actively tasked EU institutions, both the Eurogroup and the Commission. It was the command and control operator in the RRF. It was the arena for high politics, contestation, coalition building, and I've already drawn your attention to that extensive multiple bilateralism and to the fact that the heads of government stayed with the dossier, even when it came to the final negotiations. They ended up with a document of 67 pages, which will tell you the level of detail that went into those final negotiations, whereas they simply agreed to the treaties that had been negotiated by others in relation to Brexit. So that brings me finally to my conclusion and to this sense I have that we're now looking at a union of whatever it takes. That this is a union with the will to respond, to act, and to project power, to collectively frame and to mobilize, and to develop additional and experimental instruments when it can collectively agree. So in other words, I want to move the analysis from this image of weakness and dysfunction and limits to also paying attention to the collective power of the EU. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brigid. If I could ask you to stop sharing your screen. So a wonderful and very suggestive analysis. I'll offer you some comments for you to respond to in a moment. I just want to tell our audience, some people have already started to post questions in the chat. It turns out that Zoom is innovating, and I will also be able to call on people, even though we're in a webinar format, to speak. So I suggest that you either put your questions in the chat or signal you'd like to be called on, or I think that you can raise your hand in the reactions, and I will then call on you and give you the floor. We have a small audience, but it's quite a high-powered and select audience, which includes both ACES colleagues and colleagues from elsewhere and students. So basically, three comments. The first is on the essential message of the paper, collective power, the Europe of whatever it takes. I mean, another way to think about that, and which maybe bridges a little bit to the analyses of previous crises, is that rather than thinking about the EU failing forward, we should probably be thinking of it as succeeding forward, in the sense that, just as we can't expect the EU to function as a state, so too, the problems are sufficiently complex that we can't expect big bang package deals that resolve everything at once, but step-by-step solutions, sometimes very dramatic ones, like what you described with the European Council and the RRF. The second point, and I think perhaps it's an invitation to deepen a little something that you said, which is about the EU as a compound polity, and why that's important to counter images of weakness which are derived from classic state models. I think it's particularly true on the administrative side, because there, if we ask how can we resolve the paradox that the EU is probably the world's most strongest and most influential regulatory power, and yet it has a very small own administrative apparatus. And that the answer, of course, is that in its administrative tasks, the EU mobilizes the administrations of the member states in all kinds of complex networked formats. And that's true even of the most advanced forms of integration, like the single supervisory mechanism for banking union, which is indeed a mechanism and has joint decision-making at the highest level by the European Central Bank and the member states in its supervisory board, but also in the supervision of individual banks through the joint supervisory teams. And that brings me to the last point, which is how should we think about the new kind of governance in which the European Council plays a key role, but the European institutions and administrations are also critical. And you talked about the ways in which the European Council tasks the Commission, the Council itself, the Eurogroup. And I wonder what you think of this interesting work on so-called new institutional leadership by Derek Beets and Smates. Sorry, I'm forgetting his first name. And they draw this very interesting distinction between the European Council as a control room, but which can only really get things done by working together with the machine room of these different European institutions, the rotating presidency of the Council, co-repair, the Council working groups, the Commission, but also the various committees that support both. And I think that is really insightful, and I wonder whether you would agree that that's a good way to think about it. I mean, one could also put it this way, and I'll stop here, that the European Council is a body of heads. I mean, in all senses, heads of government, but also talking heads, but it has no hands. And in order to get things done, you need not only heads, but hands. And the hands are in the machine room and in the institutions also that connect the European legislative and administrative process to the administrations of the member states. But maybe I'll let you respond to those 3 points.
Firstly, on the succeeding forward or failing forward, that special issue basically argues that not everything is failing forward, but that it's very common. But I think there's a problem with the failing bit all the time, because if you get momentum and it's pretty continuous, then is it always failing forward, etc., etc. So I think that if we think about public policy making, yes, you can get very major shifts, critical junctures, but you have a lot of good old Lindblom muddling through or muddling up. In other words, you drive the consensus, and of course the EU is a hyper consensus system still. You drive it as far as you can drive it, but also step by step on complex problems might not be the worst way of approaching them. But we should also not underestimate the extent to which the EU develops quite significant areas of policy almost on a project basis, a modular basis. And I'm thinking here of the new Green Deal. And the new Green Deal is a massive project with 55 different pieces of legislation. There'll be policy instruments, there'll be a border carbon tax, etc., etc. But that the idea that the EU doesn't work on isn't strategic, I think, again needs to be questioned, because the single market was a major project in and of itself with an internal logic and cohesion, and was prosecuted. And the same, I think, on the Green Deal. Now, how successful or whether the methods and instruments are correct with the Green Deal is another matter. On the Compound Polity, yes, I think that needs to be developed more in two senses. The sense that you had, that you rightly pointed out about the resting on the administrative capacity of the member states, but also the bringing of the member states into the Brussels arena. Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times wrote a piece yesterday that I found very irritating, and he kept talking about Brussels versus the national, whereas the national is everywhere in Brussels, always was. So I think that in both senses of the multi-level system, it works. And then on the governance, so I think the distinction between the control room and the machine room is actually very well made. I think a lot of the literature on EU public policy making and institutions pays far too much attention to conflict between the institutions, which is there. They have different rules and contestation, but also we need to pay more attention to how they collectively work together. And certainly what I will reveal in the Brexit book was what I will call in the end the co-evolution and co-creation of the response. Individuals in the council working and making sure that the member states were on board, people in Task Force 50 in the Commission, but also then linking very intensively with the Brexit group in the Parliament. And it was the intensity and continuity of engagement is very striking. These were, so the Commission would begin to develop a policy, a discussion document on a particular part of the negotiations, and they would come into the Council Working Party and would engage with the Council Working Party almost word by word, line by line, day-long meetings, so that everyone in the end bought into and felt they owned the EU's response. So that sense of the intensity of engagement across the institutions on these big dossiers, I think we don't capture well in the literature.
Thank you. So I'm now going to allow our first questioner to speak. That's our ACES co-director, Luisa Bialuszewicz. And so let's see if this works. So Luisa, I'm allowing you to talk. Okay, here we go.
It seems to work. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Brigid.
You can even do that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Brigid, for this wonderful talk. And especially thank you for outlining very clearly the dangers of conceiving the EU in a statist and actually statist territorial rubric, against which, as you noted, it can only fail. And to my mind, it's really interesting that the same obsession seems to have taken hold also of EU politicians who now increasingly speak in what is entirely a statist language of sovereignty to describe what the EU should do, can do, this idea of reclaiming power, as though, it does not possess power, and here again, we're in a very kind of limited understanding of power. So I wanted to ask you what you make of this language, because I think it contradicts directly the EU's nature as a polity, and in fact misrecognizes precisely this relational power that you're talking about. And I guess, linked to that, I mean, I was really wondering how we can use some of the kind of new topological understandings of power to rethink how EU power works. So very similar to what you were talking about as the ability to get things done, but perhaps emphasizing even further how power is articulated, precisely through the kind of ability to extend your reach through relations. So I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts, and thanks so much for this.
Thank you. Well, that's a great question. And I think when one looks to why the discussion of European sovereignty, the strategic autonomy, I think that's entirely driven by the world the EU finds itself in. And the EU always had this normative power projection, that sense that the world would be a very good place if the world was more like Europe. Well, the EU now lives in a world of hard geopolitics, the return of geopolitics, great power competition. And I would say the use of the word sovereignty is in fact, and strategic autonomy, is an inchoate discussion on how the EU can project collective power, not within the EU, but more globally. And I think it will be a very important, in the EU over the next 10 years, because that world out there is going to become less comfortable for Europe and not more. And I think if we look at what happened on the Polish-Belarus border recently, so very quickly, the EU, both the member states and the Brussels institutions, responded by dispatching commissioners and senior officials across those countries from where the refugees and migrants were originating. They also began to deploy power, the sanctions vis-a-vis Belarus itself, and used market muscle in terms of, and will increasingly use it in terms of overflights and flights, etc., etc. So again, I think it's, and when I look at EU trade policy, there was a recent review of EU trade policy, and I can't, there were 3 words. One was open, the second one I can't remember, but the third I certainly did remember because I've never seen it in a document like this before, and it was assertive. So I do think that fits with the collective power, but it's the projection of power in this sense, which is probably closer to a status interpretation of power, because it's the EU vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But it's a great question.
Thanks, Brigid. I'm wondering whether there's anyone else in the audience who might like to ask a question, either by putting it in the Q&A or by having me recognize them. I mean, I see, for example, our governing board member, Christina Eckes. Maybe, Christina, you'd like me to call on you? But I'm not, okay, here's a Q&A. Okay, I'm going to allow Christina to talk. She's also posted something in the Q&A. Christina.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, it seems still an odd new feature of the webinar. Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I found it very inspiring, and I very much like always the positive note that I take from your talk and also from your Twitter interventions. My question is the attitude that you outlined, the question of that the EU becomes an EU that does whatever it takes or acts along that logic. What is the fundamental difference between this logic and what has often been criticized as a TINA logic, the logic of there is no alternative, that we have heard in narratives surrounding both the financial economic crisis, but that I'm also very familiar with in the area of counter-terrorist measures, but that also basically is the fundamental logic of the compensatory logic of all EU criminal law that was not very popular with member states when we started out. So I understand it's slightly more positive, I think, so more supportive in tone, but I think it both argues very much for one solution that we can't avoid, let's say. So if we don't want to end up in disaster, let's say. So I actually see quite a lot of parallels to these arguments. What is the fundamental difference? Thank you.
Well, again, another great question. And so I think for me, the TINA, and particularly the TINA logic in during the Eurozone crisis, was very much a dynamic of creditors versus the debtors. It was very much bound up in a morality tale that you have no alternative but to engage in austerity. But there were alternatives. But at the time, those who could have, I mean, a European safe asset was the obvious quick response to the Eurozone crisis, and it would have been cheaper and in human and economic terms, much wiser. So the TINA was very much driven at the time by the creditors. Whereas I think that whatever it takes is, in my view, particularly in the two crises that I spoke about, in Brexit, whatever it takes was we will protect the polity, whatever it takes. And it was very much driven by the sense of the EU as a polity and a collective. And of course, in COVID, there were lots of alternatives. You could have had national procurement of vaccines, and the RRF did not have to happen. I mean, what's striking about the RRF is that there were 4 available veto players, but they didn't opt to exercise the veto. And I don't know, because I haven't followed and don't know enough about the Netherlands and the government and the thinking in the government. Was it that they thought that they should agree to an RRF, but wanted, in a way, to use their opposition, to get side payments, which they did in terms of rebates, but also the balance between grants and loans and the overall size? I just simply don't know enough about the position of the Netherlands to know, did they really feel TINA on this dossier? Perhaps they did, these were small, in the end, 4 small countries against the rest. So I do think that TINA and whatever it takes are different dynamics.
Thank you, Brigid. There's clearly a difference between we must find a solution, and there could be different solutions, and there is no alternative. I mean, you could say that, it's clear that there was learning in the EU from the failures of the Euro crisis in the RRF. But it raises a question about, one area where the EU really still struggles. And you said a little bit about this in relation to Belarus and the external border, and that is migration. And the question there is, it the nature of the problem that is really very intractable, given for example, your concept of the politics trap that you didn't mention, but where the interactive politicization of issues at the national and the EU level can lead to decision-making paralysis. Or was it rather that in certain ways there was mismatch or a series of miscommunications between the Commission and the European Council, between the machine room and the control room in 2015, that meant that they didn't work together in this kind of co-creative, constructive sort of way. There is a piece by the same authors, Smeets and Beach, which tries to use their framework to make that case for migration. But I just wonder. I mean, migration is clearly and asylum is the tough nut to crack today for the EU.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a highly politicized area. It's politicized at EU level, within member states and between member states. It's also a challenge that faces different countries differently. In other words, having lived for 8 years in Italy, one was acutely aware of the pressures of the Mediterranean transit route. Again, I think it was interesting that this time it was the eastern border, and neither Poland nor the other countries in the eastern half of the continent had showed much solidarity to the Mediterranean countries in earlier phases, but now found themselves confronted with a regime whereby Lukashenko was prepared to use his state capacity to basically move people. And I think it was the response of the EU, and when one thinks of there is a humanitarian tragedy working its way out on the eastern border with the winter, that the EU is resisting and has resisted so far any movement of any number of those refugee asylum seekers, stroke migrants, because I think the definitions are extremely difficult, to move them across into the EU. In other words, the EU is prepared, and I think it's the weakness of EU migration and asylum policy internally, at least the lack of consensus internally, has led the EU to externalize the problem. I mean, that's been the route to reducing the numbers. And the EU with its deal with Turkey, etc., etc. Was it because there was the machine and the command weren't working so well together? Well, it was the Council of Ministers that agreed one of the burden sharing regulations, and did so on the basis of qualified majority. So it wasn't the Council versus the Commission, it was the fact that there was on an issue that perhaps one should and required unanimity, or at least consensus, a high level of consensus, was not available. So again, I think if I were to look at what's happening on the Belarus border at the moment, then whatever it takes translates into an EU that in some senses defense of borders is becoming more state-like, or in the way in which states historically have wanted to control their borders.
Thank you. There is a question which has been posed anonymously, but which maybe follows on from that. So the question is the EU prepared and willing to respond firmly to military crises that will surely arise in future without the support of, for example, the United States?
Well, I would say at the moment, absolutely not, because the deployment of military forces requires a command chain. And I see no evidence that that's available in the EU. Now, there is talk about, we've had the battle groups. The battle groups were rarely deployed, or if ever.
Never.
And I don't think they ever were. But they're talking about another form of a coalition of the willing with an available battalion of some kind, 35,000 troops by 2025, 2026. I would say that what happens in that basket is entirely contingent on what happens NATO. And if NATO ceases to be a reliable instrument guaranteeing the security of Europe over the next 10 to 20 years, then the EU will respond militarily. But the EU, I think it's one of those areas in defense, the EU, the member states spend a lot on defense, they just don't spend it very effectively. I think it's one of those areas where the sum is much less than the parts. And so one can see improvements in effectiveness and capacity in security and defense in the EU long before you get to the stage of deployment and whatever. So I think at the moment I see no, I mean, there's PESCO and there's a whole ecology. And I know von der Leyen spoke about it, the need for to go beyond an institutional ecology in her State of the Union. But I think it'll take, I would say that the security element that one will see even more development in the next five years is Frontex. We've already seen Frontex is a very different organization than it was 10 years ago already.
Thank you, Brigid. And actually, Frontex, like the single supervisory mechanism, is currently, and if it develops more, will be even more in the future, a very complex mixed organization, which has some permanent staff, some seconded staff from the member states, and then we'll be able to call on a further set of, let's say, emergency border and coast guards from member state administration. So this is another area where the EU is developing some executive capacity, but in a way which looks very different from a classic state, and which is compound, maybe even in a new way than EU agencies have been before. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I think that we can thank you for an exceptionally stimulating lecture and discussion. It's very nice that we can now blur the boundary between the webinar and the seminar, and people can in the audience can also speak. We'll use that again in the future, and we hope that we'll be able to entertain you in person in May when you come for your lecture in The Hague, that you can also come here, and we'll continue the discussion. So I'll see you in a moment in the breakout room. I think you've received an invitation to that in your email, and I will just say good night to the rest of the audience, and thanks for being with us. If you enjoyed it, tell your friends and relatives to watch it on our YouTube.